What if I told you that in the middle of an icy desert, where temperatures drop below 40 degrees, you could sleep warm with only a thin skin between you and the storm? Outside, the wind howls, strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet, and the frosty air burns your lungs with every breath, turning everything alive into ice statues. But inside this strange conical structure, there is incredible peace, a crackling fire, and people sleep without heavy blankets, feeling completely safe. It seems like an impossible violation of the laws of physics, but the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains have used this engineering magic for centuries to survive in the harshest conditions. Watch the video to the end to find out how ancient nomadic technology surpassed modern developments and why an ordinary snowdrift could be the main salvation from certain death. Are you ready to learn a secret that will change your perception of primitive housing? When European travelers first saw the teepee, they considered it a simple tent, incapable of protecting against the harsh winter. It seemed to them that a thin covering of bison hides could not retain heat when an Arctic cyclone was raging outside. However, they overlooked the most important element of the structure, which was hidden inside and was a major engineering marvel. This was the inner lining called dew, or ozone, which transformed the cold tent into a real thermos. This canvas made of leather or thick fabric was attached to poles inside the teepee at human height and hung down to the ground. Between the outer covering of the teepee and this inner wall, there was an air gap several centimeters wide. This air pocket, invisible to the eye, functioned like the most modern insulation in the walls of our homes. Cold air entering from below under the outer covering did not enter the living space where people slept. Instead, obeying the laws of physics, it rose up this air corridor to the smoke vent. This constant flow created a powerful draft that pulled the smoke from the fire outside, preventing it from accumulating inside. At the same time, the heated air from the hearth remained in the center of the room, reflecting off the inner lining back to the people. Modern engineers spend millions developing ventilation systems, but the Indians came up with the perfect air circulation scheme hundreds of years ago. Thanks to this double wall, there were never any drafts inside the teepee, even when the wind outside was uprooting trees. The interior remained an area of absolute calm, where the fire burned evenly and quietly. This allowed a comfortable temperature to be maintained even with very little fuel. It is important to note that this inner wall also protected the inhabitants from condensation, which inevitably forms when there is a temperature difference. Moisture settled on the outer skin and dripped down or evaporated without dripping onto sleeping areas and belongings. Dryness was essential for survival, as a person in wet clothes freezes in the cold in a matter of hours. This system worked flawlessly, providing a dry and warm microclimate. In addition, the lining served as an additional screen that prevented shadows inside the teepee from being projected onto the outer walls. This was a matter of security, as enemies could not see how many people were inside and what they were doing. Thus, a piece of leather served as insulation, ventilation, waterproofing, and camouflage at the same time. It was an ingenious solution that did not require any complex materials. Installing this inner wall was a mandatory ritual in preparation for the winter season. Without it, the teepee was considered a summer dwelling, unsuitable for sleeping in sub-zero temperatures. The women of the tribe carefully monitored the condition of the lining, understanding that the lives of the entire family depended on its integrity. Any gap or tear could disrupt air circulation and release precious heat. It was this element of the design that made the teepee a unique structure, unmatched by any other nomadic dwelling in the world. Yurts and wigwams used other principles of heat conservation, but the double wall system with active ventilation was the pinnacle of engineering thought on the plains. It allowed people to live in comfort where it seemed impossible to survive. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Why do you think modern tent manufacturers rarely use this ingenious principle of double walls with air draft? Write about it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new analyses of ancient technologies. What if everything you've been taught about construction is outdated in the face of this ideal shape? We are used to thinking that a reliable house should be square, sturdy, and stand on deep foundations. But on the Great Plains, where winds reach the speed of an express train, any flat wall becomes a sail. A rectangular structure that encounters the force of nature inevitably experiences enormous stress and can be destroyed. The conical shape of the teepee was not chosen by chance or for aesthetic reasons, but thanks to harsh natural selection. The cone is perfectly streamlined on all sides, and the wind simply has nothing to catch on to in order to overturn the structure. Air currents flow around the sloping walls, pressing the dwelling to the ground instead of trying to lift it. The stronger the wind blew, the more stable the teepee became, as if growing into the ground under the pressure of the elements. The frame, made of long poles tied together at the top, created an incredibly rigid and elastic structure. The poles were not fixed in place, which allowed the entire structure to breathe slightly under gusts of wind. This elasticity was the key to its strength. Where rigid wood would break, the tied frame only bent slightly. The entire load was evenly distributed across the sloping beams, going straight into the ground. In addition, the teepee was always set up so that its rear, which was steeper and stronger, faced the prevailing winds. The entrance was located on the leeward side, usually facing east, towards the rising sun. This prevented cold air from blowing inside when entering and exiting. This orientation was not just a tradition, but a strict rule of survival. The slope of the walls also played a crucial role in effectively heating the interior. Heat from the central hearth rose upward, and reflecting off the sloping walls, returned back to the floor. Unlike a cube, where heat accumulates in useless upper corners, in a cone it circulated in the living area. This allowed for the most efficient use of the energy from each log burned. It is important to note that the cone shape provided ideal resistance to snow loads. Snow could not accumulate on the steep walls in dangerous quantities and slid down under its own weight. This freed the inhabitants from having to clean the roof in the middle of the night, risking frostbite. The dwelling was self-cleaning, maintaining its lightness and strength. Even the covering material, tan bison hides, contributed to the overall aerodynamics. The hides were heavy and dense, and they did not flap in the wind like modern synthetics, creating unnecessary noise and vibration. The stretched skin became a drum that muffled the sounds of the storm, creating a feeling of silence and peace inside. This psychologically calmed people, allowing them to sleep even in the midst of bad weather. The installation of the teepee itself required precise knowledge of geometry and balance of forces. An incorrectly placed pole or an incorrect angle of inclination could cause the structure to lose its wind resistance. Knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, and every man and woman in the tribe knew this algorithm by heart. It was architecture perfected by centuries of trial and error. Thus, the cone proved to be the ideal shape for life on the open steppe. It combined minimal surface area with maximum internal volume and stability. Nature itself suggested this solution to people, and they learned to use it masterfully. Aerodynamics saved them from the wind, but how did they manage to control the fire inside the wooden frame without causing a fire? In the next chapter, you will learn about the intricacies of smoke control, which bordered on art. Want to know a secret that could one day save your life if you find yourself near a fire in any enclosed space? This knowledge seems simple, but in reality, it is the result of centuries of observation, practice, and engineering genius, born not in workshops, but in the harsh reality of the plains. The greatest threat to people living in dwellings with open fires has always been not cold, rain, or lack of food, but smoke. It can quietly and imperceptibly fill a space and suffocate sleepers faster than they can open their eyes. For many peoples of the world, smoke was a constant problem that they were never able to completely solve. But the inhabitants of the North American plains found a unique, surprisingly elegant way to tame fire. Their teepee was not just a tent, it was a sophisticated life support system where every detail served a single purpose: to allow smoke to rise and escape outside while keeping the heat inside. The pinnacle of this engineering marvel was the smoke vents, often referred to as ears. These two movable flaps at the top of the cone look simple, but in fact are a complex mechanism for regulating draft. They were attached to long poles protruding above the roof and could rotate, open, close, and catch the wind, like giant ears that could sense every gust. They were controlled by long sticks that were always kept near the entrance. A person who knew how to operate the valves became a living thermostat. They could make the smoke rise in an even stream, increase the draft during cooking, or completely close the opening during bad weather. In skilled hands, it was a real ventilation system. Operating the valves was similar to controlling ship sails. It was necessary to understand the wind, to feel its direction and strength. As soon as the wind changed, the person on duty, usually the most experienced member of the family, would go outside even on the darkest night to rearrange the poles. He knew what angle the flaps should be at so that the wind would create a low-pressure zone above the opening. Then the airflow literally sucked out the smoke, making it easier to breathe inside. If this was not done, the entire dwelling would instantly turn into a suffocating smokehouse. An open fire would become a deadly enemy. An experienced host could determine a change in wind direction by a barely noticeable change in the sound of the flame or by the movement of the fabric at the entrance. This was not just a skill, but part of a culture passed down from elders to younger generations. When it started to rain or snow, the flaps could be almost completely closed, turning the opening at the top into a kind of temporary roof. In such cases, the fire was extinguished or the coals were left to smolder, providing gentle warmth. And even with the flaps completely closed, the heat was retained thanks to the special shape of the tipi, in which the air circulated gently enough not to blow the heat out. The ability to close the sky in seconds made the tipi a refuge, immune to the whims of nature. But the hidden magic of the tipi was also inside. The inhabitants often dug a narrow channel, a blower, which started outside, passed under the walls, and led directly to the hearth. Fresh air flowed through it, feeding the fire with oxygen. Thanks to this, the warm zone in the center was easily maintained, and the smoke did not spread across the floor, as happens in ordinary tents. The fire burned cleaner, smoldered more evenly, gave off more heat, and produced less smoke. This air duct would play a huge role in the survival of many modern tourists who still suffer in smoky tents, not understanding why traditional engineers dealt with this problem so elegantly. The location of the hearth inside the tipi was also not accidental. It was placed slightly closer to the entrance, rather than strictly in the center. This took into account the slope of the poles, the direction of natural air currents, and the height of the cone. The smoke rose like it was going through a tunnel, sliding along the inner surface of the fabric and going up without touching the people sitting in the back. In large tipis, the hearth could be moved just a little bit, but that changed the ventilation a lot. Everything was thought out, tested by generations, and perfected. Fuel was no less important. For night heating, dry, dense woods were used, which produce a lot of charcoal and almost no smoke. Wet logs were not thrown into the fire at night. They were dried on a wooden grate suspended above the hearth, where the heat turned the moisture into steam. Choosing the right firewood was part of survival and part of domestic craftsmanship. Smoke in a tipi was considered a sign of carelessness. Clean air was a source of pride, and smoke was a source of shame. A good host always kept an eye on the ears, the fire, the firewood, and the bellows. It was an active living system that required attention, like a pet or a garden. That is why the tipi was not just a house, not just a shelter from the wind and cold. It was a well-designed machine, created to convert fuel into heat and comfort with minimal loss. It was a balance of fire and air, thick fabric and wind, skill and observation. Where modern tourists suffocate from smoke in their tents, ancient peoples lived for years without experiencing even half of the problems we consider inevitable. If you enjoy learning about such amazing technical solutions of the past and how people have turned nature into an ally for millennia, please like this video. This will help us create even more stories about the craftsmanship, engineering, and survival of ancient peoples. What if I told you that the floor of a tipi was not just dirt, but a complex engineering map? The distribution of sleeping places inside the dwelling was never random, but obeyed the strict laws of thermodynamics and social hierarchy. The warmest and most honorable place was at the back of the tipi, directly opposite the entrance, behind the hearth. This is where the head of the family slept, receiving maximum radiant heat from the fire and minimum accidental drafts from the door. People slept with their feet toward the fire, forming a kind of sun or circle. This had a profound physiological meaning. If the feet are warm, the whole body feels comfortable. Blood circulation quickly carries heat from the warm feet to the rest of the body, maintaining overall body temperature. In addition, this arrangement allowed people to jump up quickly in case of danger without disturbing each other. The earthen floor was never left bare, as the earth is an excellent conductor of cold, capable of draining the life out of a sleeping person. It was covered with a thick layer of dry grass, sage branches, or willow twigs. This natural mattress created an air layer that insulated people from the frozen ground. Sage also gave off a pleasant aroma and repelled insects if they woke up from the heat. Thick bison hides were laid on top of the plant bedding, fur side up. Bison fur has unique properties that trap warm air between the fibers. The result was a soft and incredibly warm carpet that could be walked on barefoot even in freezing temperatures. It was the basis of comfort, turning the earthen floor into a warm bed. For sleeping, they used sleeping bags sewn from skins with the thickest winter fur. Often, several people slept under one large skin, warming each other with their body heat. Shared warmth was an important resource that could not be neglected. On the coldest nights, dogs were also allowed inside, becoming living hot water bottles. The space closest to the walls was used to store belongings, supplies, and tools. These bundles and boxes created an additional insulating barrier around the perimeter. The cold that penetrated the outer wall and lining was met with a barrier of belongings. In this way, the living space was protected by several layers of defense. The places closer to the exit were considered the coldest and were usually reserved for less prominent family members or guests if there was not enough space. Firewood was also stored there so that it could be quickly thrown into the fire without stepping over sleeping people. The logistics of movement inside were designed to minimize heat loss. An important detail was the door threshold, which was made high so that cold air would not flow inside along the floor. The entrance was covered with a heavy skin, often weighted with a wooden plank at the bottom. It fit tightly to the edges, acting as an airtight lock. All this created areas of different temperatures inside the teepee, and everyone knew their place in the system. The cozy microclimate was the result of collective effort and proper organization of space. The teepee was not just a room, but a complex mechanism for sleeping. In the next chapter, you will learn how ordinary snow, which we consider a source of cold, was used to insulate walls. Winter on the Great Plains brought tons of snow, but instead of fighting it, the Indians turned it into their ally. Snow, which consists mostly of air trapped between ice crystals, is an excellent insulator. The inhabitants of the teepee used this property to create an additional external barrier for their dwellings. As soon as the first steady snow fell, it was deliberately raked to the base of the teepee, forming a high mound around the entire perimeter. This snow belt could reach a meter in height and reliably close the gap between the ground and the cover. It blocked any low drafts that could penetrate under the skins. In effect, the teepee received an additional foundation of snow. Inside the dwelling, between the outer skin and the inner lining, dry grass or hay was stuffed into this space. Combined with the outer snow wall, this created a sandwich panel with incredible thermal insulation properties. The cold could not penetrate the snow and grass from below, and the double wall stopped it from above. This technique was simple but extremely effective. The snow wall also pressed the edge of the tire to the ground, taking the load off the pegs. In strong winds, this was an additional guarantee that the teepee would not be blown away. The snow melted from the heat coming from inside and then froze, forming a solid ice ring. The dwelling literally froze into the landscape, becoming a monolith. However, it was necessary to ensure that the snow did not touch the inner lining and did not soak it. For this purpose, special woven mats or willow frames were used. Controlling humidity in such a structure was a delicate art. Wet insulation ceased to work, so the condition of the snow wall was monitored. Interestingly, snow was also used as a source of water when the rivers froze too deeply. Clean snow was melted in cauldrons over a fire to obtain drinking water without leaving the warmth. This saved energy and calories that would have been spent on a trip to the ice hole. Winter life was optimized for energy conservation. This use of natural materials made the teos an organic part of the landscape. It did not oppose nature, but was integrated into it. People did not try to heat the street. They created a tiny oasis of warmth using the resources of winter itself. In the spring, when the snow began to melt, the embankment was simply destroyed and the water drained into the ground without flooding the dwelling, if the location was chosen correctly. This seasonal architecture left no debris or traces behind. It was absolute environmental friendliness dictated by necessity. The use of snow as insulation is known to many northern peoples, but in the construction of the tipi, it was perfected. This allowed them to survive temperatures that killed unprepared travelers in a single night. Knowledge of the properties of materials was the tribe's greatest asset. Snow retained heat, but what exactly provided that heat inside the dwelling when firewood was worth its weight in gold? In the next chapter, you will learn about the fuel that was literally lying at their feet. Ready to learn an even more shocking truth about what it took to keep a fire going in the boundless prairie, where the horizon stretches to the sky and trees are as rare as rain in the desert? In the Great Plains, wood was a real luxury. It was found only in river floodplains and ravines, where poplars and a few other species grew. The rest of the space was covered with waves of grass that rustled in the wind, but were completely unsuitable for long-term burning. In such conditions, anyone who heated their hearth with wood was considered either lucky or wasteful. Therefore, indigenous peoples sought another source of energy, one that lay underfoot in abundance and was renewed every season. We are, of course, talking about dried bison dung, which was so poetically called bison-chips. This material was a real treasure for the inhabitants of the steppe. It dried evenly in the sun, became hard, light, and surprisingly clean when burned. Unlike wood, especially coniferous wood, it did not produce sparks that could burn through the skin of the tipi and turn the dwelling into a fiery torch in a matter of minutes. Every spark in such a house was a threat to life. That is why chips were valued no less than the best types of wood. They smoldered gently, evenly, for long hours, retaining heat even in fierce steppe winds. Preparing this amazing fuel was a science in itself. In the fall, women and children collected dried flatbread, stacking it in tall piles near their homes, like small towers of warmth. Sometimes the chips were sorted by size. The smaller ones were used for kindling, the larger ones for smoldering at night. This was the foundation of winter autonomy. Good reserves could determine whether a family would freeze in February or spend the winter in relative comfort. When real wood was finally obtained, usually poplar growing on riverbanks, it was treated with almost gratitude. It had thick, sweet bark that horses enjoyed gnawing on in winter. Poplar wood burned cleanly and for a long time, without producing acrid smoke that could fill a teepee in minutes and make people cough until they cried. That is why poplar was considered the best natural, premium firewood. Coniferous species were used rarely and reluctantly. Resinous chips shot embers, and each ember was a potential hole in the wall of the dwelling. Fuel economy was elevated to an art form. Huge fires in teepees were strictly forbidden. They destroyed the draft, created too much smoke, and could damage the skin from which the walls were made. A small fire, compact like the heart of the house, was much more effective. It was surrounded by stones that heated up and became a kind of heat accumulator. Even when the fire was almost out, the stones continued to give off the accumulated heat for hours, maintaining a cozy climate inside. Keeping watch over the hearth was considered a matter of honor. Often, this task was performed by elderly people or those who woke up easily at night. Their job was to keep the fire from going out and prevent it from growing too large. It was very important to maintain the right level of smoldering, one that did not require waking up every hour to add fuel. An experienced person knew how to keep the sleeping fire going until dawn. In the morning, it was enough to throw in a couple of dry branches or lumps of fuel to rekindle it, as if it had never gone out. The fuel supplies themselves were carefully stored in a dry place, usually in bags or baskets near the entrance. This not only protected them from snow, rain, or ice, but also allowed you to quickly get the right amount of chips or firewood if the weather suddenly worsened. Every unit of fuel was valuable. Everything was stockpiled, from good firewood to small dry pieces of manure suitable for kindling. Lighting a fire was another important skill. They used tinder made from dried grass, tinder fungus, or finely shaved bark. The flint and steel were kept in a separate bag, carefully protected from moisture. Losing a flint in winter was a disaster because without it, it was incredibly difficult to start a fire. It was like losing control of your own life. Sometimes before going to bed, the coals were deliberately covered with a thin layer of ash. This created a kind of heat incubator. In the morning, it was enough to lightly rake the ashes and let air in, and the coals would come back to life, as if breathing. This method was called sleeping fire and was used everywhere. It saved both fuel and energy. This complex strategy, honed over many years, allowed families to live for weeks and months with virtually no dependence on wood and without suffering from the cold. They used what the prairie generously provided: bison, sun, wind, and knowledge of nature. They turned animal waste into the foundation of their civilization, into warmth, without which life in the harsh climate would have been simply impossible. In the next chapter, you will learn what happened in the teepee when darkness fell, how the distribution of responsibilities changed, how they prepared for bed, and what small rituals maintained family life in the harsh conditions of the steppe. At sunset, the teepee turned into a fortress, living by the strict laws of wartime. Night was the most dangerous time of day. The frost intensified, and predators and enemies could take advantage of the darkness. Therefore, sleep in a teepee was never completely relaxed rest. It was a state of alert anticipation. The door was securely locked from the inside with a system of sticks and cords that could not be opened silently from the outside. Inside, someone was always awake or sleeping very lightly. Usually, it was the women who kept an eye on the fire and the children. If a child uncovered itself in its sleep, it was immediately covered to prevent hypothermia. Caring for the warmth of others was instinctive and automatic. The men's weapons were always at hand, at the head of the bed: a bow, arrows, a knife, or a tomahawk. Everything was ready for battle in a second. Even in his sleep, a warrior subconsciously controlled the space around him. This tension was the price of family safety in the middle of the wilderness. Particular attention was paid to sounds from outside. The walls of the teepee let sounds through, and experienced ears could distinguish the crunch of snow under a wolf's paw from human footsteps. Any unusual sound instantly woke the inhabitants. Silence was the best guard. Dogs, which often slept inside or at the entrance, served as living alarms. Their reaction to external stimuli was the first warning sign. In addition, the warm bodies of the dogs kept people warm, creating a symbiosis of safety and comfort. If a storm began, the men checked the reliability of the poles and the tension of the skins. In case of extreme wind, they could add their weight by holding onto ropes or poles to hold the dwelling in place. The struggle for the house could last all night. The psychological climate inside was as important as the physical one. In the cramped confines of the enclosed space, people learned to be inconspicuous and to respect each other's boundaries. Conflicts were nipped in the bud, as quarrels could destroy the fragile balance of survival. The night was also a time for quiet conversations and the transfer of knowledge. The elders told legends, explaining natural phenomena and the history of the tribe. With the howling wind outside, these stories were particularly poignant, shaping the worldview of the young. The morning began long before dawn. The women were the first to get up to stoke the fire and heat the water. By the time the men woke up, the tipi should already be warm. This rhythm of life had remained unchanged for centuries. Safety at night was ensured not by thick walls, but by the vigilance and unity of the family. The tipi was a living organism where everyone performed their function for the common good. It was indeed warm inside the teepee, but this warmth felt different from that in modern apartments, where radiators heat indiscriminately. There was no overheated dry air in the teepee. There was a soft, living warmth emanating from a small fire and heated walls. Therefore, clothing was not just part of the wardrobe, but a second personal layer of the dwelling, a personal mini teepee that everyone wore. To take everything off, as is customary in our homes with central heating, would be not only strange but also dangerous. People only took off their heaviest fur cloaks, moccasins, and outer capes, leaving on their tunics, leggings, and soft inner layers of finely crafted suede. Suede was the ideal material for nightwear and homewear. It combined softness with durability, breathed well, and protected the body from sudden temperature changes. The leather protected against drafts, which sometimes penetrated the teepee due to the wind or air currents at the ears of the smoke vent. In such pajamas, one could not only sleep comfortably, but also instantly run outside in case of danger, enemy attacks, wild animals or emergencies, and not freeze, even if it was 40 degrees below zero outside. Feet required special attention. At night, they wore special sleeping moccasins, soft, wide, often lined with fur. It was a kind of shoe version of a blanket. They did not restrict blood circulation, and the dry grass that was sometimes placed inside acted as a natural insulator, providing additional dryness and warmth. The people of the Great Plains knew a simple truth. Frozen feet meant a painful night, and no skin could save you if your body couldn't warm your limbs properly. The main element of bedding was bison skins, or robes. Winter bison skins, with their thick undercoat, were a true masterpiece of natural insulation. In terms of its ability to retain heat, it surpassed many modern materials. The fur not only kept you warm, it created a dense, cozy capsule around you, an almost invisible cocoon. Pressing the fur against your body, you felt as if the bison itself was guarding you in your sleep, keeping the cold at bay. Children were covered especially carefully. Babies were wrapped in whole skins, sometimes leaving only their tiny noses exposed. Infants were placed in cradles lined with soft moss, a natural diaper, insulator, and absorbent all at once. The moss absorbed moisture so that the child's skin remained dry and warm, which was essential for health in the harsh climate. Such care saved the lives of dozens of generations. Drying clothes before bed was another important part of the evening ritual. Clothes saturated with sweat after a long day of traveling, hunting, or working on the farm could become a deadly trap if worn while wet. Therefore, outer clothing, gloves, leggings, and sometimes even moccasins were hung on special poles closer to the top of the teepee, where the warmest and driest air gathered. By morning, everything was dry, becoming not just warm, but slightly heated, perfect for starting a new day. Hair, which was long and thick for many, was braided or tucked under leather headbands at night. This not only prevented tangling, but also helped to keep the head warm. Personal care did not stop even in the harsh conditions of the steppe. It was part of the culture, self-respect, and general discipline. If the cold intensified, they switched to winter mode, adding extra layers of clothing. The principle of layering, popular among modern tourists, has been used here for centuries. Several light layers created air pockets that retained heat better than one heavy layer. Those who lived in Tipis intuitively understood aerodynamics and thermodynamics much better than many modern people. Each item had its own value, its own soul, and its own story. The clothing was the result of long and painstaking work by women who tanned the hides by hand, making them soft, supple, and light. Each tunic and each pair of leggings was sewn for a specific person and decorated with embroidery, symbols, and beads. It was a personal world that warmed not only the body, but also the heart. As a result, the system of protection from the cold was a complex, well-thought-out complex. From the outer snow wall around the teepee to the lowest shirt, each layer played its role. It did not just retain heat, it completely neutralized the cold, turning a fragile dwelling made of skins into an amazingly effective winter survival machine. Waking up in a teepee in winter is a special ritual that requires willpower and practice movements. During the night, the fire usually burned down to embers, and the temperature inside dropped, although it remained significantly higher than outside. The hardest part was climbing out from under the warm skins into the cool morning air. The first to wake up was the person responsible for the fire. His task was to quickly revive the flames before the others woke up completely. The sound of the embers being fanned and the crackling of the first twigs was a signal to the whole family that a new day had begun. As soon as the fire flared up, warmth instantly filled the small space of the cone. The second important task was to melt snow or ice for water. Morning drinks were essential to get the body going. Hot herbal tea helped to warm up from the inside and provided energy. Breakfast was simple, usually leftovers from yesterday's dinner or dried meat, pemmican. Then they started checking their gear. The men looked over their weapons and skis, while the women checked their supplies and clothes. Everything had to be ready to go. Winter days are short, and they couldn't afford to waste any daylight hours. If snowdrifts had accumulated at the entrance overnight, they had to be cleared away. This was done from the inside, pushing the snow out with a door curtain or a special shovel made of bison bone. Clearing the exit was essential for safety. Inside the teepee, frost often formed on the poles above the inner lining in the morning. When the air warmed up, it could start to melt and drip. To prevent this from happening, it was necessary to manage the ventilation properly, gradually raising the temperature. This was also part of the morning routine. Body care included rubbing with snow or washing with ice water for hardening. Despite the cold, cleanliness was strictly maintained. This invigorated and strengthened the immune system. The family discussed plans for the day. Who would go hunting? Who would stay in camp? What work needed to be done? Communication was clear and concise. Everyone understood their role. Morning in the teepee was not a torment. It was a celebration of life. The very fact of waking up in warmth in the middle of a deadly winter was a small victory. People greeted the sun with gratitude. As soon as the sun rose, life spilled out. Children played, adults worked. The teepee remained standing, waiting for its inhabitants to return in the evening to warm them again. Modern houses are anchored to the ground by heavy foundations, like anchors that keep them in one place for decades. But the true strength of the teepee lay in the opposite, in its complete independence from the landscape, in its ability to move with people, rather than forcing people to adapt to it. In winter, when resources were rapidly dwindling, staying put meant condemning oneself to hunger and cold. Firewood disappeared, game fled with the winds, and water could freeze over. The ability to dismantle one's entire home in a matter of minutes and take it to where there was, life was not just a convenience, but a fundamental law of survival. When it was time to move, the teepees were dismantled in a strict, well-rehearsed order. Everything was done in reverse order. First, the outer skins were removed and carefully folded. Then the inner linings were dismantled, and only then did they move on to the poles, which were gathered into even, balanced bundles. The lightness and thoughtfulness of the design were striking. The entire house was transformed into a compact set of parts that could be loaded onto a sled. These sleds, long forks made of poles, were pulled by dogs or horses. Thus, the teepee became not just a dwelling, but also a transport container, a storage system, and part of the general equipment. The house traveled with its owners. The nomadic lifestyle left no room for hoarding. Every item had to be useful, otherwise it was left behind without regret. In the teepee, there was no such thing as for beauty or just in case. Everything had practical value, from a pot to a needle. Such minimalism was not a fashion, philosophy, or style as it is today. It was a harsh requirement of reality. Extra weight meant extra load on the animals, extra delay during the transition, extra risk. Therefore, junk simply could not arise. Everything happened quickly at the new location. As soon as a place to camp was chosen, an almost choreographed process began. The women, who were true engineers of the teepee, set up the dwelling in 15 to 30 minutes. In winter, this speed was a matter of life and death. It was necessary to stretch the skins, build a fire, melt snow for water, and warm up the interior before darkness fell and the temperature dropped. Several neighboring families working in sync could set up an entire village in literally half an hour. Dozens of neat white cones suddenly appeared on an empty patch of steppe, each of which soon had a fire burning inside. Choosing a place to spend the winter was a science in itself, passed down from generation to generation. The ideal location was considered to be a lowland protected from the wind by hills, trees, or a river ravine. The availability of water, access to firewood, and sufficient space for animals were all critically important. A mistake could lead to disaster. Too open a place meant icy winds, too damp a place meant disease, and a lack of fuel meant an inability to survive the cold. Therefore, the tribe's scouts usually explored the territory in advance and chose the best locations for their camps. One of the striking features of the teepee was its maintainability. If a pole broke, it was replaced with a new one. If the skin tore, it was simply sewn up. The house was constantly being renewed and lived in, while remaining the same familiar dwelling. This architecture was not temporary or disposable. It was eternal in its flexibility. Unlike modern tents, which become unusable due to a broken zipper or cracked pole and end up in a landfill, teepee materials served for years and then took on a new form. An old hide could become clothing, moccasins, or craft material. Nothing was lost. Everything was turned into something useful. This dwelling has proven its effectiveness over time, measured not in decades or centuries, but in millennia. The teepee has survived ice ages, climate shifts, animal migrations, wars, droughts, and winters that could have destroyed immobile civilizations. To call it primitive is to completely misunderstand its essence. It was a precisely calculated machine for autonomous living in which every detail worked with nature, not against it. Winter survival for indigenous peoples was not a struggle, not a resistance to the elements. They did not try to defeat the cold. They learned to live in it, weaving themselves into its laws and using them to their advantage. The teepee, covered with skins, warmed by a small fire, surrounded by a snow wall, was the result of this wisdom. It allowed them not only to survive the winter, but to exist in it naturally, freely, and safely, maintaining harmony with the surrounding world. We have examined the structure of the teepee and understood that it is not just a piece of leather on sticks, but a complex engineering system. Ventilation, thermal insulation, aerodynamics, all these principles were known and applied in practice long before the advent of physics textbooks. The warmth in the teepee was provided not by powerful heaters, but by a deep understanding of nature and family unity. In conditions where a modern person with their gadgets could die in a day, entire families with children and the elderly lived comfortably and safely. They turned the deadly cold into a normal living condition with which one can and must coexist. This is a lesson for all of us. Comfort does not depend on the amount of technology, but on the ability to use what you have wisely. What impressed you most about the winter teepee? Was it the invisible wall of the lining or the use of manure as fuel? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the channel to learn more about the forgotten technologies of the past.